Did you hear a hopeful sound out there? Oh, okay. I appreciate the prayer a moment ago, and this is not just a custom, but I believe it is actually fulfillment of a divine command when we have one of us to lead in our thoughts as we approach God. Now, of course, on a daily basis, we pray privately. Hopefully, we all do that more than once per day with a great deal of regularity. And it's a privilege to come here and have someone to articulate words and the sentences just reflect what we all pretty much have in mind anyway. It's good to see you all this morning. Now, we have been discussing here for the last few weeks manners and means of conducting home Bible studies. In keeping with that theme, but broadening it a little bit. In fact, you could say, backing up some, I wanted to talk about a topic that has been raised here in the past. And I would like for us to consider this today, careful to avoid any mundane issues about which we're all worried at the moment. It's going to be hard, but I'd like for us to do that, to consider some of these big principles, these big ideas, and then see how they may be applicable to us. But see, there's the rub. When we're considering the application of general principles from the Bible, we have to do so to the lives in which we find ourselves, into our circumstances. We have to make application. So there is always that danger that in discussing biblical principles and relating them to current events, we could end up being overwhelmed by the current events when the principles should predominate. That's my point here, because events come and they go. The circumstances change. How fleeting things are in this world. But these principles don't. And if we were to live to be 500 years old, if we were to, hypothetically, these principles would still be just as applicable to whatever society we find ourselves in as they are now. So one of the things I wanted to back up and look at, and I say back up because of the description of this aspect of evangelism, is what many scholars have called pre-evangelism. Don't let that throw you. I mean, they don't have to be scholars to say that. Pre-evangelism. Now, what do you mean by that? Well, it's preparation. It's laying the groundwork for actual evangelism. I'm thinking of evangelism as something like this in a home study. You're sitting down and you're opening the Bible. Both of you, the person with whom you're having the conversation and you, and maybe others in the room, are reading passages of Scripture. And then you're asking questions and they're making comments and they're asking questions, and you're conversing so as to lead them to a proper understanding of biblical interpretation, to see the need, to get right with God in the proper way, the plan of salvation that's really revealed in the New Testament. And this means eliminating a lot of the prejudices and misconceptions that they have received from almost all of their training, maybe the churches where they've attended. That's evangelism in the strict sense. But what do I mean by pre-evangelism? Well, it's preparing the ground, preparing the hearts and minds of persons with whom you desire to have such Bible studies, such old-fashioned Bible studies. Not everybody is susceptible to the idea. If you were just to sit down and ask a large number of our contemporaries, would you want to study the Bible with me? Some might be polite. Some might not be. Some would be polite and just brush you aside and say, well, we'll consider that sometime, or words to that effect. But not as many would appear to be as eager today, and you have to ask why. Why are not as many apparently as eager to study from the Bible in that old-fashioned sense as 4 or 5 decades, 6 decades ago at least? Why? Well, some things have occurred in society, which means we may have to back up a little bit and try to open up with the heavy artillery. I've heard that expression, that figure of speech. Now, that metaphor is taken from the military, obviously, and of course, I don't know much about that. I've just watched movies and documentaries, as have probably most of us. And we see that before they begin an offensive, the infantry will not usually go in until first the artillery has laid down a barrage and softened up the enemy. That's the idea. Our brother Walter could tell us about that, having been in the Navy. So soften up the was it the Navy, I believe it was? Soften up the enemy. Pulverize their strongholds, and then, the infantry comes. Okay, the figure of speech then has to do with our softening up the opposition. You see, if you're wanting to sit down and discuss whether baptism is for the remission of sins, you have to first ask, is that person with whom you would like to have that conversation ready for that discussion? Or perhaps that person is not really convinced God exists. Oh, maybe she has a general idea, some notion of it, and she may not be bold enough to come out and say, I'm an atheist. I deny God exists. But she may have serious doubts. And many of our contemporaries do, because that's the way we've been taught in our school system. It's what we hear all the time in the media. So you have to deal with that first, you see, because it won't do any good to convince her baptism as taught in Scripture is a necessity. Okay, that's an interesting point, but what does that mean to me? I don't worry about it, because see, all the premises that flow from belief in God get taken into this discussion too, such as morality, our violation of the moral law, the fact we sin when we do that. We sin in other ways. We sin by failures to do good. Often that's the greatest sin, is by our shortcomings and not living up to the standard, not so much flagrantly violating the standard, though we do that too. So that flows from it. The necessity of the cross, somebody had to die to pay the penalty of sin. None of that matters if you don't first begin with God. So you have to make sure that that premise is held in common. And many times you still find persons around here who thankfully are convinced God exists. And as you probe, you find out their concept of God is fairly accurate. It isn't always, though, and again, the reason for this pre-evangelistic work. Some will say, yes, I believe in God. But then you start asking, well, what's your concept of God? And you could really be surprised. That word is used in so many ways today. Ways that sometimes are just outright contradictory one to the other. There are some who mean by the word God just the sublime physics of the universe. And they really are awed by how nature works. And the more it is studied, the more our mouths drop as we realize the intricacies of it. But they don't make the connection to an intelligent being behind it, a personal being independent of it, which is the biblical concept. In the beginning, God. You see, God already is when the biblical narrative begins with creation. But they just look at God as kind of coextensive with the universe. Others consider God, some liberal theologians of the 20th century, and it has influenced us in this century, as just one's ultimate concern. Well, don't we all have an ultimate concern? For some people, it's hedonism. For a large number, just pleasure. But that's God. That's one's ultimate concern. Paul talked about that, whose God is their belly. A euphemism. We don't have to go into that, but their God is their belly. And you can see why he used the euphemism. And we know it's just the pleasure principle. So that's God. You have to be sure that you have established what is meant by God. If a friend of yours is a member of the Christian Science group, there are not a lot of those around, but there are some. Occasionally you'll meet them. They won't have the concept of God taught in Scripture. You've got to work on that. And many, again, as I say, are not outright bold atheists, but they are bothered by many doubts. So pre-evangelistic work is absolutely required. In that sense, we in the churches of Christ have a task that is related to, but is slightly distinguished from, pure evangelism. Our pre-evangelistic task means we need to try to be involved in influencing culture. Now, what do we mean by culture? There are a lot of ways to put it, but archaeologists use the terms in technical senses. But basically, it'd be the mores, the norms that define or describe a given group of people, a given society. Society is kind of like a synonym. At the heart of culture is religion. Now, I know some would doubt that, but that is well established even by the sociologists who just descriptively study cultures around the world. The heart, the core of any culture is its basic religious belief. Now, religious belief is probably not the best choice of terms. They use it, but it's their ultimate metaphysical belief. And maybe that's not the best. That's kind of pedantic or kind of intellectual. Maybe we should just say their ultimate view of what's real. That's at the heart of culture. So our job then is to try to influence culture at that basic level. And for all kinds of reasons, even if you don't convert people, if many of your neighbors are atheists, if most are atheists, you don't want to live in that neighborhood. You don't live in that neighborhood. If most believe in God, even though they may not be church members, it might be a better neighborhood because you can trust that they're not going to come in and steal the silverware or harm your children. Yeah.
When you say culture, I mean, of course, the thing that springs to mind is television and movies and that sort of thing. And of course, God, the idea of God, the definition of God has been under assault for years and years and years, decades. Even if you have someone that wants to, talk about God in a spiritual, religious, serious way, it's always a watered-down version of God. You have, on the one hand, you have evolutionists, you have humanists that, they say, well, you can have God, but God really isn't responsible for the universe, but you can pretend if you want to. It's not a big deal. But then on the other hand, you have religious people that their idea of God is just not much better than that, because God is my friend, He's my buddy, He wants me to go to heaven, and so again, the thrust of all of that is to take away the agency of God, to take away the potency of God, to neuter God, and I don't like to use, I'm trying not to be disrespectful, but people's idea of God is being neutered because He has no power in a lot of people's minds. And even the people that say He has power, do they really believe it? Because again, they say, well, it doesn't matter what I do because God loves me and God wants me to be saved. So they're taking away His agency, His will, and replacing it with their own across the board. And so, on both sides of the aisle, I think we have a really difficult hill to climb.
Exactly. And in terms of your comment about culture, that's true. When you look at entertainment and what captivates our attention today, those are cultural indicators. They're indices, you might say, for us to figure out where a culture is. But at the heart of any culture is its core beliefs. And if it has a skewed idea of God, of course the culture itself is going to reflect that in its behavior. You see, this is the practical reason for looking at this. It isn't just to step here in the clouds where we're trying to figure out why things happen as they do and what we might possibly do as individuals and as collectively the Church of Christ to make some changes in the world to help shift the culture itself back in a better direction, to change the trajectory if we could, because we know America is in a real moral mess. Not just this nation, but most of the world right now. All of the West, I think, has deteriorated to that extent, has lost its biblical moorings that once were characteristic, even if it was under an aberrant form of Christianity, Catholicism. At least it had good influence in terms of moral views. Of course, the East was lost. If it was ever known, the idea of God widespread in the East has been lost, especially to, ironically, a Western idea, a Victorian idea of Marxism. We'll discuss that, the Lord willing, if we have time. Radical shifts of thought of the average citizen are characteristic of our time, and that's seen every time we come to church. And we have to avoid running over bodies who are out getting fitter and fitter. They can't go to church service to get their spiritual welfare in order, but they can get in front of our cars where we can barely make it down the streets, like running a gauntlet because there's so many joggers these days. You can see I'm not a big fan of jogging. But no, seriously, it's an issue. It's just showing not many people are that spiritual minded. It's a secular country now, very secular. Society has been secularized. It used to be members of the church who were well prepared. I'm thinking of a brother Wagner down in Montgomery, a former colleague of mine, a friend of mine who was in classes with me at Erskine Seminary. Used to hold seminars all around the country. He wrote a lot of books and tracts. We wrote some tracts, I know, and handout materials in which he warned of the dangers of humanism. We used to hear a lot about that in the 80s, in the Reagan era, the dangers of humanism. Well, even then we had to define our terms because it was confusing. Humanism is a good thing in terms of, the individual, like in the Renaissance, having the right to learn how to read and to study and to figure out what the truth is and to figure out what the Bible says instead of what the Catholic hierarchy is cramming down their throats. So that's good humanism, but we're thinking of what is called secular humanism today. The terminology has kind of been replaced by secularism. The idea of the secular is this world itself, the mundane world. Stateism is another term, and that's related, but that has to do sort of with a political aspect of the worldview. It's a consequence. It's one of the political consequences of that worldview. And even socialism, again, a more narrow political consequence, though secularism does not always produce those consequences. It can be manifested in other ways. Many times it will go in that direction.
It just makes me think about when Jesus was tempted of Satan, back in Matthew chapter 4, and he takes him up onto the exceeding high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and says, all these things will I give you if you'll fall down and worship me. I don't know that was actually something he could do, but I mean, the implication is that he would be able to do that for Jesus. So it kind of makes you wonder that, in the times that we live in now, how many people has maybe Satan tempted in the same way and has given them power over the kingdoms of this world?
Well, for millennia, he has been the king of this world, because earthly kingdoms willingly, voluntarily submit to Satan's ways and his principles. That's a given. It's hard to know if he was telling the truth to Jesus, because he's a liar anyway. And yet other things indicate that, as we will see in some passages, that he is the prince of the power of the air. He is the king over the principalities and powers and the rulers of the darkness of this world. That's all true. But we're looking at ideas right now. Of course, Satan uses ideas. That's true. The spiritual reality behind it all is Satan, evil. But what are some of the ideas that Satan will use in society to cause people to submit to him rather than to God? An author, many of you have heard of him, named Tim LaHaye a few years ago, described our situation as a battle for the mind. If I recall, Dr. James Dobson, many of you are familiar with his writings and his work on the radio, Focus on the Family a few years ago, did a lot of good work. I admire much what he did. Talked about how we are in a cultural war today. That terminology, as I've mentioned here recently, I think was picked up by the one-time presidential candidate, Pat Buchanan, back during the primaries. And, well, was it 1990 or 92? I believe it was 92 maybe, in Houston, I think. The Republicans had a convention, and he dared to get up and to tell the tepid Republican establishment they were involved in a culture war, and they were horrified, and he was shut up and not allowed ever again to speak in a public way and represent the Republican Party. Kind of shows you how far they had already gone by that time. And but he was right. He was not making that up. This was not even his terminology. He just kind of borrowed it from others who say, yes, we are in a culture war. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, how do we define culture? The core belief, which is religion. So really what we're saying is we're kind of using gloves to say that. Take the gloves off and we're saying we're in a religious war. It's a war between belief and unbelief, faith and anti-faith. That's what it boils down to, and that's what many meant when they said that. Dr. Francis Schaeffer, who wrote a great deal on this subject some time ago, said we have moved into a post-Christian world. Now he's thinking about the West. He wrote for the West. He was from the United States, but ended up living as an expatriate there in Switzerland, I think, most of his days, and had a big institute there that influenced a lot of young people who were trying to find themselves, moneyed young people who had the resources to travel there, such as Nancy Percy. I've mentioned her many times. She was one of his disciples. Os Guinness, another famous disciple of his, ended up at L'Abri Institute, and there he said, we have moved into a post-Christian world where he says Christian truth has ceased to be the guiding factor determining our way of life, which implies, of course, it used to be. It used to be the guiding factor. Not that everybody was a Christian, not that there was never corruption. There was. Chicago, for example, has been corrupt probably for 100 years or more, if not longer. The machinery that runs it, maybe Philadelphia and other places. Corruption's been around, but by and large, the country was guided by Christian values. And he also wrote, little by little, morality and freedom started to crumble. Because those things go hand in hand, morality and freedom. When morality crumbles, freedom also crumbles. Freedom can only be guaranteed by a moral society. An amoral society, or better yet, an immoral society, one that outright flaunts the moral principles of heaven, is a society that inevitably leads to authoritarianism. Something fundamental has changed. Law and government no longer provide a foundation of justice and morality, but have become the means of licensing perversions of all kinds. These are quotes from Dr. Schaefer back a few years ago. He also said, education has become the enemy of religious truth and values, and the media have provided the means for propagating the change. Now, I wanted to focus on that because recently I've talked about several times the famous jurist or justice. He was once a Supreme Court justice in the United States, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. from the 19th into the 20th centuries, who was considered to be, he wrote a paper, I think it was read in about 1895, for a large group of lawyers that became one of the most influential papers in the American legal system, in which he said we've got to quit looking at law as based on moral principles, right and wrong. We've got to start seeing law for what it is. Why would you reject that, Justice Holmes? Because right and wrong are relative. Why? Because Darwin proved there is no God. He was an atheist, an evolutionist. So it makes sense. What is right? What the strongest who will survive can get away with. The weakest, therefore, their views will not prevail about right and wrong. So he's right when he says something fundamental has changed. Law and government no longer provide the foundation of justice and morality. Some have called this a second great civil war, and it's a great civil war of values. A few years ago, it was said there were over 10,000 Marxist professors on American college campuses. I think the number has grown since those figures came out astronomically. 90% of the professors in many Midwestern universities were or are even still Marxists, advocating the very point of view of our enemies that sought to destroy us and that are still seeking to destroy us. So society has been secularized. Any comments or questions?
Well, just going back to and I hate to keep throwing Satan out there, but you asked the question, and I'm not saying that that people are literally making deals with the devil like you might see in a movie, but that's the promise. That's always the promise of the devil, is some sort of knowledge, some sort of alternative. I was looking at the Church of Satan because I think I'd heard this before, but they don't worship Satan per se, but they view Satan as an archetype, and it says they view him as a positive archetype who represents pride, individualism, and enlightenment, and of course defiance against God. And what else is there? I mean, how better a way to describe the things that are going on in our society that have gone on for millennia, as you say, but a rebellion against God, a seeking after this forbidden knowledge, but what is the knowledge that Satan gives? It's always tainted. It's always a lie. There's always a lie involved with it. So it's a futile effort, and it's a subversion.
That's true. It's a lie, and Satan does use intellectual tools. That's why the battle is so feverishly pitched at the moment. He uses the halls of higher learning. He uses the secondary schools, every level of education, to promulgate the big lie. That's true, the big lie. So we Christians then, in our pre-evangelistic work, and also while we continue to edify each other, and also while we do evangelism, it's always useful to bring some of this up as it is appropriate. In our pre-evangelistic work especially, we have to refute the big lie. We have to refute the lies of the devil. When he says there is no God, we need to provide reasons to show why. And to help us understand how the secularization of this culture has come about. It can be reversed. But it's going to take teaching the truth as opposed to men continuing to believe comfortably the big lies of the devil. This shift in this worldview that we are talking about to secularism, as we mentioned a moment ago, does have far-reaching consequences for morality. Studies that were done a few years ago, such as, you've heard of the famous Alfred Kinsey. He came out in he did supposedly a number of studies, interviews with people about their sexual habits and mores and so on. And then I think since then many have discredited his work because he didn't have a large enough sampling. Often he would extrapolate too quickly and would jump to conclusions without a large enough sampling of the evidence. But he brought up how that homosexuality is biologically determined. He argues. We hear that all the time. That's almost a given today. People think it's just genetic. And then many have looked into it to see if maybe pedophilia and incest may also be that kind of behavior. And of course, evolutionists, we talked about this recently, there's this field of evolution, sociobiology, in which they are trying to explain genetically these kinds of what we used to think of as aberrant behavior, such as incest and even rape is considered to be a holdover of natural selection. Well, why? Well, it's still here. The people still perform these acts that we would think are wrong. But natural selection allowed it to continue. Nature must have had a reason for it to continue. Why does rape? Well, a man who gets around a lot of women, even against their will, leaves more progeny, and with more progeny, there's more of a chance for his genes to prevail over the competing genes, the competitive genes of other humans, and so he wins out. I mean, we think, man, that's evil, but that's the implication of biology, of this evolutionary psychology, it's also called, where you try to explain behavior and beliefs, especially moral beliefs, in terms of natural selection. Of course, you can explain anything in terms of natural selection. Anything people do, well, it must have conferred a survival benefit. Why? Well, it survived, didn't it? People still do that. People still commit rape. Obviously, there's a survival benefit. It's what you call a tautology. It's a meaningless statement. You can prove anything by it, therefore it's meaningless. You prove nothing by it. So you have that consequence that grows right out of the secularism, the point of view in the beginning, there is no God. Jeff?
I'm just going to point out that people that do these studies and that perform these experiments, most of the time, if not all the time, these people are mentally unbalanced. They're perverts themselves. They have a mental problem. And it's crazy to me how people, even to this day, still, with all of the problems, with all of the obvious problems that these people had about them, that they still will defend them and defend the things that they preached and they teach. They taught.
Well, people are duped easily, and again, part of it has to do, I suppose, with the aura of authority that comes through the school setting. Teachers are supposed to be smarter than we are. That's why we're in class and we're taking notes to hear what she or he has to say. The assumption is, I wouldn't be here if I didn't think you hadn't learned more about it than I did. So, I mean, and that aura of authority, sometimes it's justified, hopefully many times, but it's not always, can cause people to let their guard down and not be critical thinkers. Oh man, this is one of my pet peeves about how we're just not critical thinkers. And I don't mean by critical being negative, fault finders, or pessimists. That's not what I mean. Critical thinking skills has to do with the ability to hear an argument or a set of propositions that are set forth, hopefully as evidence of a conclusion somebody wants you to believe, and seeing where the obvious flaws may lie. It's very simple to show some logical fallacies, such as the one I mentioned many times. It came up in a classroom years ago where a student tried to tell the teacher logic is no good. Logic doesn't work. And the teacher was amused. He said, well, tell us, enlighten us. How's logic so bad? He said, well, you can prove anything by logic. He said, for example, you can start out with the proposition that all goats have glands, different glands. Yes. All people have glands. All humans have glands. Yes. Therefore, all humans are goats. Okay. Somebody want to critique that? I mean, I'm talking about critical thinking. I'll tell you what the professor said in a moment. It's very simple. Betty could tell you because she hears me talk about it all the time. I used to take logical fallacies and I'd put them on poster boards and label them like A, B, B, B. Put them all around the kitchen. And when she would say something to me, I would just say, B, B. I didn't do that. I used to threaten to do it. I never actually did. I'm just kidding. What's the logical fallacy? All goats have glands. All people have glands. Therefore, all people are goats. It's called the fallacy of the undistributed middle. Goes all the way back to Aristotle. He said, you can't do that. It won't work that way. You can't distribute in that direction. You could say all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, what can you conclude? I'm from Mars. I don't know Socrates. But somebody just convinced me all human beings are mortal. And then he says, Socrates, this individual, is human. What would I know if I didn't know anything else about Socrates if I knew those two things? That he's mortal. So yes, logic does work. Now that's that's an easy fundamental error. There are some that are more subtle than that. When somebody wants to discuss whether or not we should have a law in a state that restricts abortion and says it should not be performed up until the moment of actual birth, actual live birth taking place and killing the baby. If some state tries to have some semblance of morality and not to be a bunch of barbaric types as they are in many states now, and you try to point that up with just logic, many times they'll say, oh yeah, well, I knew before you had a bill and your bill was going to make poor people get even poorer. You wanted to tax people such that these poor people would lose all their benefits. So I'm not going to listen to you. That's what the opposition would say. It's a total non sequitur. It's irrelevant. But people are persuaded by fallacies. So we need more critical thinkers. We need to be involved in teaching ourselves how to think critically. And just think of it. It used to be called old horse sense by the farmers, common sense, and this is what's so lacking in our time. So the shift to secularism has led to the moral quagmire in which we find ourselves. And it's a direct consequence. It isn't just an aside. Secularization and thus the weakening of morality all around us will continue despite the fact Christian numbers have been, at least until recently, on the increase. Now, Christian in the broadest sense. I think 90 million Americans identified as evangelicals just not long ago in the polls. 90 million. Today, there are about 328 million Americans, give or take, that we can count. 328 million Americans. So 90 million, that's pretty good. That's not quite a third. It's just a little bit less than 1 out of 3. Call themselves evangelicals. The sad reality is, of the number, when we look at those who are members of the Lord's church, it appears at best there are no more than 1.3 million in the United States, members of the church. 1,300,000. Now that was like a couple of years old, and that does not really take into account people who've fallen by the wayside in that time, who identify and answer, as Christians, answer the pollsters that way, but who don't go to church. So faithful Christians, how many? I don't know. I don't have any quantifiers, specifics. Probably quite a bit less than 1.3 million. Lately, with the pestilence that has come in from China, from the Communist Party of China, it has done such damage even to American services, religious services. Could be, I don't know. On any given Lord's Day, how many? Maybe a little bit more than half, maybe 700,000 or 800,000 Christians are worshiping God. Maybe fewer. In California, I think they're still shut down. I don't know. They have been some good brethren in Orange County, some good, faithful, sound members of the Church of Christ over there in Orange County, and yet they're not allowed to meet. So we're talking about secularism, despite the fact 1 out of 3 potential voters could vote toward moral points of view, but do not always do so. And in fact, just because a person identifies as evangelical doesn't mean that person will vote about platforms and about ideas and about laws and referenda, or even about politicians themselves who happen to share their religious point of view or moral point of view. There's a disconnect. There's a big disconnect. Among some ethnic groups, it appears the disconnect is quite large, but that's just anecdotal on my part. I don't know that I could prove that per se, but just based on statistics, voting statistics, seems like there's a major disconnect. Some who are quite family values oriented in their preaching on Sunday, but on Mondays, you wouldn't know that from some of the things that they seem to push and to promote, and some of the people they promote. We're just not having the constructive impact on society that we ought to have. Worse than all of that, Christian belief is under an all-out assault. I recall reading from William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig is a well-prepared apologist. He has a couple of PhDs one I think in biblical studies from Germany, very prestigious degree. Another's a philosophical degree. He's done probably as much study as anybody in Christian evidences over the last several decades. And he was talking about the fact that we're under assault and said, most people are unaware of the battles that are going on out there in the schools and in the journal articles. Now, what do I mean by journal articles? These are publications that are considered to be kind of highbrow publications. These are not just popular magazines, but these are often peer-reviewed articles that appear in scholarly journals. They're considered. So to keep, to stay abreast of the situation, if you're still teaching, several years ago you graduated from school, you got to stay abreast of what's going on, new stuff. So each month you go to the library and read scholarly journals. Journals. The articles have been peer-reviewed. What do you mean? Well, the man wrote the article, he footnoted, or she footnoted, and then submitted that to review to peers who had similar backgrounds of education, who could understand the arguments because they also study those things, who would say, that won't work. Yeah, that passes muster, or that doesn't pass muster, and so on. And for example, the one I've mentioned before, the Smithsonian Institute a few years ago had put out a journal. Not very many read it, but a few biology types did read it. And it was one that had to do with biology. It's a biological journal, the Smithsonian Institute. And the director of the Institute, the editor of the Institute, had received an article written by Dr. Stephen Meyer. And he actually brought up reasons to be critical of Darwinian natural selection beliefs. Brought up some good reasons. And before he did that, it was peer-reviewed by his peers who had credentials, impeccable credentials. They went through the article, his facts. In other words, they do the fact checking, I guess. They do the fact checking. They looked at his argument and said, hey, this is good. This passes muster. It was sent in and it was published, and a firestorm ensued. The man who allowed it to get through, the gatekeeper, was fired, immediately dismissed. By the evolutionists created such an uproar that they would dare allow the Smithsonian's paper and its prestige to be used to be critical in any way of evolutionary theory. It was just a political firestorm. Even the U.S. Congress got involved because this is their bailiwick. They're over this. They're oversight committees. And they looked into it to say he was fired wrongly, unjustly. He should not have been fired. He didn't do anything wrong. In fact, he didn't really take a stand. He was just the editor and said, okay, here's a peer. We're taking both sides. No, you're not allowed to take both sides. Okay, I got off a little bit. Sorry. Scholarly journals, according to William Lane Craig, are designed to, help people stay abreast. You would not believe the battles that are going on and the kind of bashing of Christian belief out there by highly educated men and women. It's just an incessant thing. Of course, a few courageous ones are still standing in the gap, and they're writing in response. And you do have some who are well prepared doing that. But a major battle is going on, and it trickles down. These people read these journals, get these ideas, go back to the classroom and influence the students who become our teachers in our high schools and our junior highs and whatever, grammar schools, and it gets into the kids' minds. So the whole culture is infected by these sorts of things. We're involved in a war in which the enemy is not just, ignoring us. They are outright attacking us. So it is really time to take action. Somebody asks, well, are Christian people in this country seeking to promote, for example, legislation in favor of Christian ideas and moral beliefs, reflecting the biblical worldview? Is that what Christians are trying to do? Senator Barack Obama, when he was senator, wrote a piece about that. I have a review of it on our church website, in which I tried to take him to task, in which he was wanting to compare our beliefs to somebody today saying they're like Abraham. Some Christian says, God told me I need to kill my son. So he was making fun of the story of Abraham and Isaac as the secularist Marxist that he was, no doubt. And we refuted it. I believe we were adequately cut. It wasn't very hard. It wasn't really heavyweight stuff. But anyway, he wanted to make the argument, Christians should be careful. Christian beliefs, your moral beliefs should not inform the laws of the culture, for example. Well, then, which beliefs will? Go back to Oliver Wendell Holmes. Might makes right. Some beliefs are going to, somebody's ultimate beliefs about morality, whether it be objective morality from God, or whether it be evolutionary morality, relativism, somebody's moral beliefs are going to prevail in the law schools and eventually in the courts. and in the halls of legislatures. It is inevitable. Laws have to reflect basic points of view, basic world views. Charlie Reese, writing for the Orlando Sentinel several years ago, dealt with this, and he was kind of an objective reporter. He looked at this objection the liberals make to Christians having influence in society. He says, well, look, all legislation forbidding a behavior is an attempt to impose some moral code on everyone else in the jurisdiction. They're disingenuous when they're trying to argue they're neutral. And then he goes on to say, in a free society, Christians have the same right to advocate laws reflecting their moral code as everyone else. Which code is decided by means of the democratic process? Well, you see, that's a free society. And that was written back in a free society. In an attempt to completely eradicate Christian influence, the best thing is to take away the free society aspect. And then your point of view will really prevail, because might makes right. This is what they teach us in the schools. This is what Darwin actually taught. I know today his apologists try to back off of social Darwinism. Oh, they try to say, we missed it. No, Darwin didn't mean to imply that. Oh, yes, he did. Later on in life, as he thought through the implications of his natural selection idea, he did become a social Darwinist, Darwin himself. And then others ran with that. Ernst Haeckel, others. Thomas Huxley. All these people who defended Darwin. Herbert Spencer in the 19th century. Karl Marx, when he read Darwin's book, he said, this is it. This is the philosophical justification for my theories. Marxist atheism now could be squarely based on Darwinian evolutionary theory. The same is true of any kind of belief today that's inimical to, that is hateful to Christianity, to fundamental beliefs about God and Christ and the Bible and what's right and wrong, moral living and righteousness. Chris is right about talking about the devil behind it all. He is ultimately the inspiration for it all. Recently he shared with me some material about Karl Marx himself. Strong case could be made. If there is such a thing as demon possession in the modern world, that's questionable from a biblical point of view. But if there were, the prime candidate for a demon-possessed man would have been Karl Marx. I guess you could say his knucklehead British friend Friedrich Engels too, the dupe who provided his daddy's big factory money so that this ne'er-do-well Marx could sit around and write these things and never actually produce anything worthwhile in his entire life. Just destroy the entire world with his hateful, antithetical views that are contrary to anything moral or good. But Charlie Reese was right in the Orlando Sentinel. We do have a right to speak out. We should, but we need to be careful. Look, the way societies work, any society, people band together as groups. Individuals become members of groups. They conceive of themselves as like-minded with others who share their point of view. And groups tend to combat other groups and other groups' ideas. This is the beginning of partisanship. Partisanship exists in any culture. Partisanship has its dangers. They should be obvious because the carnal side of man, our fleshly side, can get involved. It's sort of like, and this is a trivial thing really, watching a football game. And when we see the University of Georgia pound on Georgia Tech, as they do each year, and humiliate them at the end of the year, when we see that happen, some of us who are Bulldog fans go, woo, woo, woo. That's partisanship. But that's kind of trivial. In the end, we love our fellow Georgia Tech people and the football players. We love them as human beings. They may hate us. I'm just kidding. But anyway, that's partisanship. The problem is that enters into our attempt to influence society. If we become partisan and we want our guy to win because he's in our party, he's on our side, the fleshly pride side can well up. That we must be careful about allowing. We must be careful. It's hard to do. This is a challenge. We Christians have to transcend, if we can, partisanship. And yet this doesn't mean that everything in society is gray. There is black, there is white, morally speaking. And some people in some parties tend to push the black more, and that is in the sense of that which is evil, than the white, that which is good, to use biblical metaphors. They tend to do that, but not everyone. There are exceptions. Used to be. Some parties, it's hard to find any. And there are many in the party we might feel, affinity with, many who are on the side of those in the other party in terms of their basic worldview. So you got to be careful about partisanship. But there are texts in the Bible which tell us we are to change the world of ideas. We're to be involved in that. Pre-evangelism. This is the thought for today's study. 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3 through 5. Paul says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh." We don't take up our ARs and go down to the Capitol and start shooting state troopers or something like that. "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing which exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ." This is a rich passage. I've explained this before. Commentators say Paul is making allusions to what they were familiar with in their day, the Roman Navy. Basically, the Roman Navy. It was a powerful navy, and out on the Roman lake, which was the Mediterranean Sea, it eventually eradicated most of the pirates. There was a lot of problems like off the coast of Somalia today at one time with piracy going on the high seas. But the Roman Navy eradicated. But they knew it wasn't enough just to sink their ships. You had to find out where their strongholds were. And many of those strongholds were actually in Paul's native Cilicia, the province of Cilicia, the north side of the coast of the Mediterranean, the north coast. And just not far off the shores, they had these mountain strongholds or fortresses where these pirates would hold up and weather the attacks of the naval ships and then go right back out to pirates. So the Navy sent in what we would call Marines. The Romans went in and they wiped out these strongholds. That is the term that was used in Greek to refer to them. Bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. But it says, we cast down imaginations. Now, this is the King James, and unfortunately the word imaginations is not really accurate for modern English. It might have been in 1611, but for modern English, we think of imaginations as things we suppose or imagine or pretend like are the case. That's not what it means. It's the word for reasonings. It's the word for arguments. This is the idea in the Greek. Arguments people make. In other words, we're casting down arguments. This is another way of saying we do debate and we refute the false teaching of the enemies. That's what he means. It's not carnal. Remember, it's a figure of speech about carnal warfare, like the Roman Navy eradicating the pirates' fortresses in the mountains of Cilicia. But it's actually referring to the metaphorical casting down. Christians go into the world and engage in debate and cast down the strongholds and bring every thought of man's mind to the obedience of Christ. What a beautiful passage. It comes out, by the way, in the context of Paul having to refute false teachers in the church who question his apostolic authority. But the principle is wider, and it really covers all of what we're to do. Ephesians 6 and verse 12 says, we wrestle not with flesh and blood or against flesh and blood. Same idea, you see, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Spiritual wickedness. So Christ is spot on when he says that behind the ideas, behind the policies and the points of view, there is a horrible, dark force in this universe. And Paul says that, and we wrestle with that. We are to be the salt of the earth. We are to be the light of the world. We are to be the leaven of society. Matthew 5:13-16. We are the salt of the earth. We are to season the whole culture where we live as Christians. But with 328 million and 1.3 million members of the church total, according to the latest estimates, what percentage are we? I was going to get into some of this stuff. I don't want to be redundant for the worship hour, but I guess I will bring this out. It seems like we don't know how large the city of Sodom was. There are estimates, archaeological estimates, that it might have been maybe 1,200 people living in the city walls of Sodom. You remember Abraham haggled with God over saving the city if 50 righteous souls could be found? And God said, yes, I'll save the city if you can find that many out of Sodom, 50 out of 1,200, if that estimate is correct. We're already saying we don't know for sure if the estimate of the size is correct. Well, whatever the size was, God said, for 50, I'll save it. All the way down 40, 30, 20, down to 10. Abraham bargained with God, and God said, for 10 righteous souls, I will spare the entire city. I think, now actually some have said that Sodom may have been as small as 600. The figures vary between 600 and 1,200. If that's true, then we're talking about, I think, 1.6% of the population for 600. For just 1.6% of the population, God says, I'll spare the city. But if the 1,200 figure is closer to being correct, it's 0.8. It's less than 1%. And yet I'm afraid Christians in the United States constitute quite a bit less than that. 0.39%. If there is any such thing as a tipping point, see what I'm saying? I'm not real good with arithmetic, but if there is a tipping point in God's mind, it's a fearful thing to contemplate.
Well, again, just to continue with the theme, you talk about Marxism. Marxism is based on envy and strife, and there's plenty of good.
And who's the author of that ultimately?
Well, yeah, I was just going to read from James chapter 3, verse 14. But if you have bitter envying and strife in your hearts, glory not and lie not against the truth. This wisdom descendeth not from above, but is earthly, sensual, devilish. For where envying and strife is, there is confusion in every evil work.
I wish we could fit that on our marquee, don't you? That'd be a good one to remind our people of. Yeah, that's the point. You're right. Well taken that although we're discussing concepts or ideas that people have, and this is what we do in pre-evangelism, we try to disabuse them of false ideas and positively show them why they should be Christians. It's not just a matter of take a leap of faith with us and you'll be satisfied. So we're not saying that. We're not saying park your brains at the door and come into our building and we'll close off and lock the door from the world and we'll pretend like God is. This is how we're caricatured. That's the way the world wants to view it. But we want to say that we can engage them on their own turf. When they talk about science, well, there are many capable scientists out there. They're in the minority. Well, they seem to be. At least they're not as vocal as they ought to be because they get fired all over the joint. And it happens every time they speak out, case after case. The political system that runs our educational system is just overwhelming and smothering. So if they do speak out with a contrary point of view, they're often, marked and they're thrown out. But there are many capable scientists who are willing to, they're courageous. There's some who are willing to put their reputations on the line. They've been fired. They've found alternative sources of providing for their family while they do their work. And they've engaged the scientists by reading the most extremely technical scientific journals that are out there, reading through meticulously the arguments that are made by the evolutionists and seeing where the faults lie, exposing the faults and setting forth the proper facts, and thus making the conclusion, creationism is really by far the better alternative when it comes to viewing science, how we got it. Intelligent design, it is called today. So concepts are involved, but ultimately men choose to believe in evolution and things like that because of a sinister force in our universe. We are to sacrifice the whole of our being to God's cause. Everything I have, everything that is mine, I should sacrifice. And my citizenship on earth is part of it. I'm to render to Caesar the things that are Caesar, to God the things that are God. Romans 12:17. God's ideal will is this. Psalm 125, verse 3. Psalm 125, verse 3. This is His ideal will. For the rod of the wicked shall not rest upon the lot of the righteous, lest the righteous put forth their hands unto iniquity. The ideal will of God is that there be good government. Proverbs 29 and verse 2. Proverbs 29 and verse 2. When the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice. But when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn. And I think we're hearing a collective mourn or fear of the need to do so. So, we could go on and talk about possible objections. Some say all this kind of talk is the so-called social gospel. They warned about that in the early 20th century because some turned it up. Christianity nothing more than just the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, helping the poor. That's where, our Salvation Army friends came from. They're a denomination that formed in that period of time. So you just help people, the poor. That's the social gospel. And it often was socialistic in the ideological political sense. No, this is not the social gospel to talk about the need to teach Christian morality. God's moral point of view should prevail over the hearts and minds of everybody in a jurisdiction. That's the ideal will of God. And that rulers be basically good people, basically. It's been very rare to have that, though, in history. In all of history, it's been very rare. But the biblical ideal is still there. That's the ideal. But the recognition of frailty, living far below the standard, is also pragmatically in the Bible as well. Well, thank you for your attention. Sorry to go over.